So Xiao Xiao is a Chinese-born American technologist, interaction designer, and artist who grew up in New Orleans, lifelong pianist from age 4. She completed a PhD in the Tangible Media group of the MIT Media Lab with Hiroshi Ishii. She's worked on a bunch of interactive installations for museums, private clients, created a whole bunch of projects you may know, including the amazing Mirror Fugue and the TVOX singing Theremin, which won second place in the 2022 Guffman. So CV-wise, she's been a postdoctoral researcher at the Sorbonne. She's currently principal investigator at the Leonardo da Vinci University Center in Paris, Institute for Future Technologies. As far as I can see, her signature move is applying ideas from math, science, technology, artistic experience to really learning anything. Could be computer programming, piano, drawing, language learning. The thing that intrigued me most, as far as I understand it, is that during COVID, she found herself stuck in Armenia and put 3 years into learning to play the theremin. And one result of that was a fantastic paper in DIS 2024, which I highly recommend, but any of our papers from CHI and NIME are a joy. So handing you over to Xiao Xiao.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the lovely introduction. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, share sound, optimize. Let's play this. Okay, so everybody can see my screen. It's okay.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, hi, I'm Xiao Xiao. I am currently at the Institute for Future Technologies at Da Vinci Higher Education, located in Paris, La Défense. And due to a strange twist of fate, earlier this year, I became the director of the lab. And actually, we're hiring. So just one word about our lab. We are quite inspired by the MIT Media Lab. We do work in HCI, interactive technologies. We're quite a young lab, having just inaugurated last year. There's just 2 research groups with 2 PIs, myself and my colleague, Marc Tessier. We work on radically different orthogonal subjects where he works on alternative materials, low tech. I'm more in the space of embodiment, emotions, interpersonal relationships in HCI. And we're looking for a new PI who works somewhere in maybe robotics, maybe AI, maybe cross reality. But really, we're just looking for exceptional individuals who are looking to move to Paris to work with a super motivated team. And so if you are this person, or if you know somebody who might fit this bill, don't hesitate to contact me after this. Okay, so my group is called the Human Learning Group. I advise master students and PhD students, but today I'm mostly going to talk about my own work. And what I'm most interested in doing is, in relation to music, is kind of taking music as a sort of sandbox for inspiration on better understanding the learning process, as well as using it as a domain for the design of various novel interfaces. When I talk about music learning, so I first started on the piano when I was 4 years old, and this was sort of the process of traditional piano learning that I had started with, which is not my kind of reverse inspiration for design. And I want to start with this because I think this is often the mental model that a lot of people in the world, and oftentimes in music learning interfaces in HCI have of this mental concept of learning, where it's based on this typical classical piano learning where you repeat sequences of correct notes based on the written score. The role of the body is reduced to basically mechanics, and there's a focus on correctness over expression and kind of spending a long time repeating things over and over again. It's not really that interesting. But luckily, when I started my master's at the MIT Media Lab, I began to take lessons with a composer, pianist, and improviser named Donald Fox, who was really an important mentor and inspiration for me. And with him, I kind of discovered this other world, still on the piano, still looking in the space of traditional classical music, a little bit of jazz, but looking at music where it's not just about repeating the correct notes, but incorporating deep listening, having a really important role of the body in expressing music, as well as this aspect of improvisation, even when learning classical repertoire. And so this, all of these materials that I learned from Donal, from working with him, I try to integrate into my research practice. And I wrote a paper for CHI 2016 on this framework, which I had called Inspect, Embody, Invent, trying to encapsulate this learning process, not only for music learning, but for learning in other domains as well, as Simon talked about earlier. But particularly for music, I also try to fold back some of these ideas back into the piano. And so Mirror Fugue, for those of you who don't know it, it's inspired by the reflection on the lacquered vertical surface in front of the piano, where imagining where for our learning situation, if you come to this interface, you can not only see the music as the notes, but also experience how the performer embodies expression, the rhythm, the phrasing, the breathing, even the facial languages, or facial expressions. And I had another project called Andante, where trying to adapt some of these ideas, a variation of it, but toward helping kids better understand musical expression by having little animated figures run around and dance on the musical keys as a way to better understand the flow of the music. So all of these projects I did when I was a PhD student with Hiroshi Ishii at the MIT Media Lab. If you've ever come across Hiroshi at conferences, he would often ask very tough questions, and he kind of has this reputation for being this really tough guy at both in our group and at CHI, at TEI. And he would tell us kind of this weird phrase. This is very much paraphrased, but basically he would often say that the best success of a student is to one day assassinate the master. And I think it comes from maybe Japanese samurai, some sort of there's a history to that, which I can't really completely describe, but this is what I retained. And after my PhD, I decided to figuratively assassinate the master by looking at something completely the opposite of the tangible interfaces group, which I was part of, looking at the Theremin, which is an intangible interface. So I think many of you maybe are here because you are attracted to the Theremin for some reason. But for those of you who don't know what the theremin is, it was one of the first electronic musical instruments invented in 1920 by Lev Sergeyevich Theremin, or known as Leon Theremin in the West. It is special for not only being one of the first electronic musical instruments, but also being played without touch. So you've got these two antennas. On the one hand, there's this long antenna, which you use to regulate the frequency, and the other antenna, the loop one, is used to control the volume. And by moving your hands closer or farther away from these antenna, you are able to sculpt a sound. So here's a classic video of Clara Rockmore playing the theremin. And so basically you see she moves her hands in the air without touching anything. And what people often say is that the theremin is incredibly expressive, and it's often compared to the human voice. It's also been used in a lot of sci-fi films for this really spooky effect. It's quite a versatile instrument, but it's also got this unfortunate reputation of being incredibly difficult to play. And within HCI, actually, the theremin is often used to argue for the importance of tactile haptic feedback. It's often given as an example of a bad user interface because it's so hard to play for a lot of people who are just coming to it. And this has been kind of scientifically validated through Sheila Omoran's PhD thesis, where she had some people anecdotally try to play the theremin with a volume, with a rubber band between their hand and the pitch antenna. and showing that this sort of basic tactile haptic feedback made the theremin easier to play. And there was also a study which didn't have any p-values presented that showed that it was marginally easier in note finding on a pitch-only virtual theremin with force feedback. So I wouldn't call this a real theremin, but this study has been very often cited within the field of HCI to show that it's important to have some sort of tactility, some sort of haptic dimension. And this whole idea has kind of been encapsulated later into the Theremin hypothesis by Beardall and al., which says basically if a musical instrument does not provide any haptic feedback, it would probably be more difficult to play accurately. So these ideas have basically been taken for granted in the field of HCI. I remember when I first started as a master's student, I had heard about these ideas in the tangible media group. But at the end of my PhD, I wanted to really challenge these ideas. And my grounds for challenging these ideas is that thereminists do exist, and not just one of them, not just Clara Rockmore. There are many very successful thereminists who manage to play in tune consistently as well as expressively. And so, what embodied strategies do they use to gain proficiency on this instrument? And in order to find the answer to this question, I decided to learn to play the theremin myself. So, as Simon mentioned, I started in 2017, not during COVID. I started right after my PhD because I had some free time on my hands. And I started to journal my learning progress. And I also kept videos of my playing to try to track my progress. And there's on my Instagram account a whole series of videos to show the evolution. And this paper that I wrote with Sarah Dilialoui earlier this year is just looking at the first phase of my Theremin learning, where I was not only looking at this autoethnography using myself as a guinea pig to try to figure out this learning process, but also I was mostly an autodidact. And this was because back before COVID, there wasn't really this culture of online theremin learning. If you wanted to learn to play, well, you basically had to live close to somebody who knew how to play the theremin, or there were these in-person workshops that were organized, which I did attend, and there were some YouTube videos to go by, but mostly I tried to go by my existing musical experience on the piano. And this was also an opportunity for me to try to connect the dots between disciplines and try to validate these ideas about learning that I had learned in one context to try to take them to another context. So the reason why this analysis stopped in 2020 was because in 2020, when COVID started, Lydia Kavina, who is one of the most important thereminists of the day, she's actually a relative, maybe a grandniece of Theremin himself, and learned to play from Leon Theremin. And she started offering these workshops online during COVID, and there was a whole community around it. And so from this time, I had decided that this began a new chapter in my learning process where I started learning from a teacher rather than trying to figure things out on my own. So to give you an idea, just to give you some audio visuals of where I started. So this was May 31st, 2017, about a week after I started learning to play. And this is what I sounded like. Maybe there isn't that much sound, but maybe it's all for the better because it's not that great. And you can see I'm super tense. But I'm trying to play this one here. Okay, well, you don't have to, I'll spare your ears. So this is October 2017, about 6 months later or 5 months later. This is what I sounded like. Still a little bit tense, but I think I sound a bit more natural. So this is in 2019. And finally, a little bit after the period that I studied in the DIS paper, this is from 2021. And the previous piece was the Vocalise by Rachmaninoff. And this is after I had taken some lessons with Lydia Kavina. This is the first movement of the Franck violin sonata. Okay, so I had written these journal entries to document my Theremin learning process. And many years later, actually in 2023, I got together with my friend Sarah Fadili Aloui, who is quite an established HCI researcher working with dance and first-person methods. And she encouraged me to try to put something together for the field of HCI using the data that I had inadvertently collected over all these years. And so we tried to really systematically analyze these journal entries. So I first reread all the entries, then discussed with Sarah to define the set of first themes, including embodied strategies, compositional strategies, transformations, metaphors, etc. And after reviewing the entries, I added more themes to characterize the daily practice that I had engaged in back in this period of analysis. And we ended up framing the discoveries, framing the lessons from the thematic analysis into two broad categories. On the one hand, there's the operational strategies, which is what I did to learn to play the theremin, including basic navigation of the instrument, building new repertoire, and creating new music. And on the other hand, looking on the inside, looking at how I changed through the process. So documenting embodied capabilities, new ways of thinking, as well as a push and pull dialogue with the broader theremin community. So in terms of operational strategies, in terms of navigating the instrument, I think that there are three kind of broad pathways. So on the one hand, there's the importance of deep listening, focusing on making a beautiful sound, experimenting, and adjusting movements. And I should mention here that maybe the theremin is kind of an interesting example because unlike other instruments, you cannot simply follow some pre-programmed movements like press a key and use a sort of paint my numbers approach. You have to be able to find the notes and find the melodies, the gestures. And so the ear is an integral part of this process. There's also movement exploration, so playing around with movements in order to get the sound that I wanted. But once again, it's always guided by the ears. And there's kind of a deep connection between this auditory side and a movement side. And finally, I also took advantage of my existing musical knowledge of music theory. And so, for instance, learning to play intervals on the theremin, I tried to find modules and like fifths or thirds or octaves and tried to find gestures that enabled me to consistently play these intervals. And I would break down larger melodies into these smaller modules in order to practice them. And so, when putting together a piece of repertoire, there are also these strategies of, for instance, analyzing a piece to figure out here are these intervals here, here's the scale, here's the triad, and trying to go back and forth between exercises of certain modules and plugging them back into the piece. And whenever there's something that didn't quite work out, I would try to isolate what is the difficulty and invent exercises around it. There's also the process of imitation. So, listening to recordings and trying to get inside them and play along with them, which is a sort of shortcut of getting into the sound. And finally, the importance of improvisation, both when learning repertoire and also just trying to discover new sounds and new gestures. And I engaged in a lot of jam sessions with my friends who played other instruments in order to better explore the possibilities of the theremin. So in terms of transformations, what was really interesting was noticing how my auditory perception changed. So here is a journal entry where I talk about being able to clearly hear melodies hidden in speech. And even at one point, I was opening the bathroom door at my apartment and I heard and I heard La Vie en Rose in that sound. And also being able to imagine the next note played. So I think the key to being able to play the theremin is having the capacity to pre-imagine the next note when you're trying to play something. And so it forced me to have to form a really clear picture of each melody that I'm trying to play or trying to improvise, as well as forming a clear memory of different musical building blocks. And so after doing this for a while, I started spontaneously hearing improvised music in my mind, which I wasn't able to do so much before. There's also this idea of being inside the sound. So here's a quote about this, where whenever I'm inside the sound, my precision gets a lot better, as well as my ability to stay in tune for long notes. And there's a natural sense of musicality and a sense of ease. It's almost as if I can do no wrong. But if I'm not inside the music, everything feels like I'm trying to imitate it from the outside, where my body is tense. I can still play, but I feel like I'm always on the precipice of falling out of a note, and sometimes I do. And this was actually a quality that my teacher, Donald Fox, used to talk about a lot on the piano, of being inside the sound, especially when trying to improvise and trying to follow a sound. But I think on the piano, it is possible to play accurately, to just go through the right movements of playing something without actually being inside the sound. Whereas I think the theremin forces you to be inside the state in order to play anything. There's also this a similar idea, but for emotions, where when I'm trying to express myself, there are moments when I was completely inside an emotion and it felt like I was speaking through the theremin, but my voice was silent and I was using my hands to speak. In terms of other transformations, playing the theremin also gave me a wealth of metaphors to think about playing. And so one of these metaphors that I would think about is comparing playing the theremin to drawing or writing a line. And so the metaphor of practicing letters and building up a movement vocabulary, but I would actually literally see a line drawn as I trace the melody with my hands. Also thinking of imageries of landscapes and maps, and maybe this also ties in a bit with this ecological approach to music, where creating the sound is like sketching out a landscape. And I would also think of map out different pieces and try to explore different territories with different sorts of gestures. So in terms of reactions with the community, it was quite a mixed process. And so on the one hand, I found that experienced therminists who did not adhere to a standard technique were generally encouraging and didn't really tell me what I was doing was wrong, and they were quite supportive of my experiments. But on the other hand, there were certain therminists who tried to establish a traditional school of playing. And there I got a lot of feedback of like, what are you trying to do? Why don't you just follow people who have done this already? But then at the end of the day, as I was talking about earlier, I did join the community a bit more through the pandemic, through the workshops of Lydia Kavina, and I found a bit of connecting the dots with my own discoveries and with what has been already done before. So at the end of the day, the paper that I had written was about HCI and the link between the theremin and HCI. So what? So I wanted to distill a bit of takeaways. So I think for the theremin, it forces us to look at music learning beyond producing visible external gestures on an instrument, and it really forces us to consider the internal, imaginative, emotional, embodied processes that are going on that without which you cannot play the theremin. But what also interests me is being able to connect the dots between theremin learning with learning across domains, from dance to computational thinking. In some of these areas I talk about in the DIS paper, as well as making connections with existing theories of tangible interactions and embodied cognition. And this I talked about in the DIS paper as well. But I wanted to, for the rest of the time today, give some examples of interfaces that I created that were inspired by my Theremin learning experience. So earlier I was talking about the comparison between playing the theremin and speaking. And I was able to kind of collaborate with some researchers at the Sorbonne University who are working on vocal synthesis instruments to give the theremin an actual voice. And so this is T-Vox.
Il me prend dans ses bras, il me parle tout bas, je vois la vie en rose.
So the idea here is to connect the theremin, the pitch, the volume, to the pitch and the volume of the synthesized voice, and also add an additional sensor which is able to control the rhythm of the articulation. And this is a collaboration with Grégoire Locqueville, Christophe D'Alessandro, and Boris Doval. So the way it works is that we start with a monotone sample. This is actually for a Chinese poem. So we record an audio sample containing the words to be played. There's a bit of manual labeling process that I'm sure we can automate now if I were to go back to this project. And there's also, and then there's a max patch that controls everything. And in terms of the rhythm, there is, so we started by using an FSR, which is could be a better design interface. We later started using a button, but basically it's an on-off switch. And so on the right, there's a graph that shows the pitch and the volume curves of the theremin, as well as the open and closed states. And so of the button. So when it's open, it corresponds to a vowel. And when it's closed, it corresponds to a consonant. And by doing this kind of sock puppet movement, it enables you to progress in the recording. And so, as Simon mentioned earlier, we got second place at the Guthmann International Musical Competition in 2022. And recently, actually, we've been revisiting the system as a way to study interpretations of popular French songs through trying to recreate them.
Il n'est jamais acquis à l'homme, ni sa force, ni sa faiblesse, ni son cœur. Et quand il croit ouvrir les bras dans le monde, les ailes d'une croix. Et quand il croit serrer son bonheur, il le broie. Sa vie est un étrange et douloureux divorce. Il n'y a pas d'amour heureux.
So this is a rendition of the famous French song Il n'y a pas d'amour heureux. This is actually the version by Barbara, which is quite different from the original version by Brassens. And the voice that we used is actually the voice. So you see some of our collaborators in this video. Boris, the pianist, actually recorded his voice for the sample. And within the max patch, we are able to change the length of the vocal tract modeled by the program to make it sound like a woman's voice. So in terms of other new interfaces, so inspired by hearing melodies in speech and inspired by the comparison between writing and drawing, I worked on a project called Geppetto, which was also with the same collaborators, including Christophe and Grégoire, as well as other collaborators from Sorbonne Nouvelle, where I did my postdoc on this project, about learning the intonation of foreign languages using vocal synthesis. And so intonation, for those of you who don't know, is basically the pattern of pitch change on words or longer phrases that gives each language its distinct music. It's really important for emotions and affect, turn taking also, but it's oftentimes less emphasized in language learning and pronunciation learning. And it's also considered one of the most difficult aspects of language learning. And for tones, for tonal languages like Chinese, it's a huge barrier to entry. And so using the same Vox vocal synthesizer, I created this interface that enables people to draw on a tablet, either with a stylus or with their hands, in order to repronounce a phrase. So
Nick
here's an
doesn't listen
example.
to anyone.
Nick doesn't listen to anyone.
This is about the fall rise tone
Nick doesn't listen
in
to
English,
anyone.
which when you
Nick
pronounce
doesn't
with this
listen to
intonation, it
anyone.
actually means something that's quite different from the straightforward meaning. So you can also
Nick
experiment.
doesn't listen to anyone.
So long story short, so I think that this system can help to train the ear to perceive unfamiliar sound features. Using the hand gestures can also bypass ingrained patterns in the natural voice, which might interfere with producing new intonations in foreign languages. And the fact that we're using a synthesized voice enables you to focus exclusively on the intonation, on the melodic level, rather than having to pronounce strange segmental syllables also. And based on my own Theremin learning experience, where I was able to sharpen my own hearing, I have an hypothesis that long-term usage of this interface can also sharpen the perception of pitch change in foreign languages. But in terms of the experiments that we had done, we only did one-shot experiments so far, and we have found that gesture enables non-natives to be able to produce more exaggerated versions of certain intonation patterns than with their own voice. And this results in a higher rate of identification in perceptual tests with native speakers. And right now, we're currently applying for more funding in order to do more longitudinal studies with the system. So I think we're a little bit running out of time, so I'll just show one last project. So this is a PhD thesis that I'm currently co-supervising, again, using vocal synthesis, but connecting it to the rehabilitation of manual dexterity. And so we're working with a company that creates this system called the Dextrain Manipulandum, and working with stroke patients to rehabilitate their ability to press using different levels of force with their fingers. And so creating a rhythmic game where subjects are able to replay a song just by tapping the rhythm of it. Okay, so just to finish off, a few takeaways. So what about HCI? What's the relationship? So the typical narrative in the field of human-computer interaction is that the theremin is a flawed instrument due to its lack of haptic and tactile dimension. So in my own experiences, both as a theremin player and as an interface designer, I think that the lack of touch is not a problem to be solved, but actually an opportunity to focus on different dimensions of learning, listening, embodiment that are oftentimes ignored. And and throughout this experience of exploring these strategies, I think it's also quite interesting to try to apply these strategies to designs, both for the theremin itself as well as to novel interfaces across domains. And I think I will end here.
Thank you so much, Xiao Xiao. Absolutely amazing talk. So as before, anybody like to ask any questions, either in the chat or sticking your hand up one way or another?
Courtney has a hand up.
Hey, Courtney.
Hi. I'm super happy to hear. Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. I'm super happy to hear some updates on this. I know I already interrogated you about this at DIS. But I love this work so much, and I hope you saw my little applauding emoji when you were mentioning about the emphasis on tactility and some of these maybe, I don't know, we don't notice so much a lot of these other mechanics that go on in the embodiment of working with instruments that don't have tactile connections, which I know you and I have had this conversation about as singers. So anyway, I just want to say thank you again for this. I love this work so much. I have a question, actually. I didn't realize it the last time I watched your videos, but I realized how actually little you are looking around as you play the theremin. And I don't know, it kind of made me laugh for a second, but then I realized that my natural instinct whenever I play the theremin, which is very badly and not often, is to try to see where my hands are and make sure that I'm, returning to the same position or use that visual guidance. And I was wondering, number one, did you have any experience with this yourself? Did you find that you gravitated towards visual at any point? Did it go away at some point as well? And then number two, as you're playing, you're very focused and intent. And I'm curious about what maybe if you are attuned to any kind of visual experience in doing that, and if you reflected on that in your journaling.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions, and I really love your work as well, Courtney. So regarding and I think there's a lot that we can nerd out on the connection between theremin and singing and all of that. So regarding the question about the visual dimension, yeah, for me, actually, the essential part of theremin is the auditory side. And this is not only for me, but also the first workshop that I attended during the pandemic of Lydia Kavina. One of the first things that she said is that the theremin is played with the ear. And I think the visual dimension, so if you look at my later, if I look at my later videos, I think there are two sides to it. On the one hand, it's like situating yourself through the visual side. I don't think I do that so much. And even, okay, so on the Theremin, which is the instrument on which I started playing, there's a pitch indicator. And in the very beginning, I tried to use that to help myself stay in tune. But I found that using the eyes was super distracting, and it was better that I just didn't use it. On the other hand, I do think that as I got a bit better at playing, I was able to relax a bit more and maybe, not so much look around, but not stay so still as a statue, maybe breathe a little bit. And I think experienced thereminists, so there's a Thorwald Jorgensen who does use a tuner in order to start at so when you have a phrase that ends and you have to start a new phrase, you have to kind of blindly find the note. So what Lydia Kavina does is that she plays it a little bit so that only she herself can hear it. And if you listen to the Frank video carefully, there's a part where I tried to do that too, but it was a little bit visible. But some therminists have a tuner to show where they are just for entrances. And then the other side, what was the other? Can you remind me the other question?
I was just curious, actually. I know you talked about these kind of visualizations you had in your mind about constructing the scene, and I was curious if you actually noted down any perceptions that were you looking at anything, or is that even a noticeable part of your experience? When you were looking at all of your subjective experiences and journaling, did you talk a lot about what you were actually looking at?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of what I'm looking, so when I go into a trance, right, when I play the theremin, I think it's really an auditory trance, if you will,
Okay.
right? It's so much about imagining what comes next. And sometimes, it almost feels like what comes, there's a blurring between the present and the future just a step ahead. and where I hear something and I don't even know if it's what I'm pre-hearing or what I'm playing. And the visuals, so it's a good point where in some of my metaphors, I do talk in terms of visual metaphors, but I think that it's more like after the fact, I use the visual metaphors to describe what's happening. But these metaphors are kind of inspirational too. So I didn't mention in this talk, but I did a collaboration with some friends, Gershon Dublon and Xing Liu, who live in London, actually. They're super cool people. So they made this beautiful project called The Wandering Mind, which is taking field recordings and putting them into an AI model and taking the latent space where you see all of these points of these like thousands of sound samples based on how they relate to each other. And then they made a system where you can walk around in this space and you hear the sounds that are around you. And I did some performances with them, one at Ars Electronica, and I called it, what is it? Field sketches from imaginary soundscapes, where it's like basically when you go out into nature and you draw what you see, you copy the visual forms, but the theremin was kind of a way to copy the auditory forms. And so I think there is, but the visual side is simply a metaphor, because in terms of copying the forms, like I'm not using my eyes to copy the forms, I'm using my ears.
Yeah. Okay, that's amazing. Yeah, super fascinating. I'll have to check out that work. Can you send me the names of these people you mentioned as well?
Yeah. Okay, so
That'd be
I can
great.
maybe put it in the chat. I think
Thanks.
maybe I need to stop sharing. Okay, let me stop sharing. So this is Xing Liu and Gershon Dublon. The Wandering Mind is the project.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I didn't work on this project, but I did a performance with them.
Yeah, that sounds really
Yeah.
cool. I'll check it out. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think maybe Siddharth had a question. I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a really vibrant talk. So I have like two very like small parts of questions. The first one was, I was wondering if the Theremin could actually give you feedback, non-haptic feedback, but something like vibrations. Have you kind of ever thought about it? How would that kind of work with it? And the second part, as you like mentioned AI, I was wondering, what if the Theremin could learn from you as you're learning from it? What if it could learn your responses instead of you kind of being constrained to a very certain parameter or like a certain interface? How would that work? Have you ever kind of thought about it or something like that?
Yeah, okay. So first question first. So I think in this paper, I was a bit polemic in talking about, okay, you don't need tangibility, but actually, I think in real life, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite because I'm actually just starting a co-supervision of a PhD with Paul Strohmeyer and Céline Coutrix, and Paul's work is all about, well, vibrotactile motors, actuations, and using them in different situations for haptic illusions. And one of the applications that we talked about is a sort of system that can let you feel vibrations in the air to maybe let you feel the spaces between notes, or maybe when you're not exactly in tune. And so I think that there is a place for that. And maybe in the presentation also, so the examples of interfaces that were designed inspired by some of my Theremin explorations, with the exception of TVOX, right? The drawing, it has a tangible haptic dimension. The system for dextring, rhythm karaoke, that my PhD student, Paul Peter Arslan, is working on, is also quite tangible. And so I'm not against the haptic tangible side, and I think it is fruitful to explore, but maybe the rhetoric is more like, historically in HCI, I think the emphasis on tactile intangibility has kind of overshadowed some of these other dimensions, these other embodied dimensions, like listening, like auditory feedback, and kind of feeling things in your own body, which are really essential to certain sorts of artistic practices, musical practices like the theremin, like singing. But at the point that we don't forget about these dimensions, I think it's totally cool to explore haptics and tangibility, maybe even to make you more aware of some of these hidden dimensions. And then the other question about AI, about the Theremin learning. So I guess maybe the Theremin itself, right? It's just a couple of mappings. Like there's not really intelligence inside it. I did come across a paper by some roboticists who looked at training a robot to play the Theremin through like reinforcement learning. I put it in my to read list, but I haven't yet had a chance to dig in. But I think it would be cool actually to, for instance, train a couple of robotic arms to play the theremin in order to test some of these theories about what it takes to play the instrument. And here I say a couple of robotic arms because I think that the theremin is really not just the pitch antenna, which a lot of people assume to be the most important, but actually both the pitch and the volume control at the same time, which is also maybe one of the reasons why it's hard because you have to independently control pitch and volume. And I have some kind of my personal theories in explaining how to play in tune on the theremin about how the glissando, like the on the theremin, it's kind of inevitable because you can't. That's it. It's just the nature of the theremin, but you hear it less, or your brain kind of ignores it when you have both pitch change and volume change at the same time. And so when you play a melody, it's really the illusion of stopping both at the same time. But then when you're transitioning, both are changing, your brain filters out the transitions. And then the whole art is to be able to quickly transition and to make the transitions smooth. And yeah, I think it will be interesting to train a robot to be able to play that, to kind of validate these theories.
Oh, thank you so much. It makes it sound like a magician. You have to like hide certain things and play the main tunes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So I think I'm just going to try and fit in a real quick one. So I remember in the DIS paper, there were two extraordinary things that came up. One was that you were saying that away from the theremin, your perception of overtones improved was one. And I think, if I've got it right, you also said that your sight reading improved somehow from. Can you say anything more about either of those?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm a really firm believer so based on my experiences on the theremin, I think that this combination of enactment and listening and pre-imagining somehow strengthens what it strengthens the ability to imagine music, well, to hear music and to imagine music. And I think that maybe with overtones, maybe it's just a matter that before I was not really tuning in. Like these things exist, but my brain wasn't paying attention to it. And maybe through playing the theremin, I learned a sort of a deeper sort of concentration on sounds, which I think doesn't have anything to do with the theremin itself, right? It's just a mode of attention where I'm focusing and tuning in to these things. And then with sight reading, I think it's more on the imagination side, where maybe it's about kind of a little bit pre-hearing something before I play it. Yeah, maybe this is the best explanation I have for it. And it would be interesting to kind of experimentally validate. But yeah, there are some things that are still mysteries even to me. Yeah. Does Paul have a question?
Cool.
Thanks so much, actually, to both of you for amazing presentations. It's great to hear some of the more recent developments in your work. Especially, I think the last time I saw your work was in NIME in Brazil, and it's great to see how things develop. And as much as I love touch as a factor within an instrument in music making, I actually really appreciate the idea that maybe we also need to be paying attention to lots of other things that make music making and instrumentality meaningful. So it's great. It's a really great project. It's really exciting work. I think I was also very excited that you focused on group improvisation within your work with the theremin. And my question is really about whether the experience of playing the theremin in that setting was different to the settings where you were playing pre-learned repertoire, and particularly if your attention was different in any way, or if you noticed anything else different in your playing when you needed to be paying attention to the unfolding situation, or whether there was actually commonalities across those two different types of music making.
Yeah, really great question. So I think maybe I would start with saying actually, so since I started playing music as a classical pianist, right, improvisation kind of came a bit later in my journey with music. But with the theremin, what was really interesting was I started improvising really early on, because I think that there is the freedom to just draw shapes in the air in response to what I'm hearing around me. So I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the talk, but one of the ways that I started conceptualizing playing the theremin was, maybe this is related to what Lauren was talking about with the ecological approach, where I really felt like I was an animal. And it was about moving around in a sort of landscape where the landscape is always changing. The landscape is kind of what is made by the other instruments, everything that's around me. And maybe it doesn't even have to be the other instruments, right? It could just be the ambient sound in the room. And the theremin being a melodic instrument, it really felt like I was kind of this animal that was moving around. And I could either try to hide myself by making shapes that are similar to shapes that are already in the landscape, or make myself come out and become a subject in this landscape. And so this was, in this sense, it is a bit, I mean, I think this paradigm, this metaphor can be applied to any other instrument, right? But it was through the theremin that I started thinking of improvisation in this way, because I think maybe with the piano, there are so many traditions of improvising on the piano, that there's like jazz licks or playing in certain styles, that maybe it's easy to get caught up in learning the styles rather than the essence of what is happening when you're improvising.
Cool. Yeah. So an instrument that maybe we think of as super constrained, actually, in some ways, because of the lack of repertoire, gives it a certain freedom. I mean,
Yeah, for sure, certainly. And I think there's also maybe a metaphor with the voice, right? Where with the voice, you can also like sing repertoire, or you can just make different vocalizations. And I think with the voice, it's also, you can even make more sounds than the theremin, but maybe you're limited to your own vocal range, whereas the theremin has the theremin sounds, but you have the like 6 octaves of range. But I think there's actually this kind of inspires a whole train of thought of augmenting the theremin and making it be able to take on other shapes, but still retaining its thereminness. But I think a lot of people have invented instruments that are inspired by the theremin in this way.
sure. Thank you very much.